worries. Thank you, though. I really cannot thank you enough for this. This is
no worries.
helping me out so much.
So what's the class? What are you doing?
It's called The Art of Interviewing.
Okay.
I've gotten to the point where I don't have to take real classes anymore, so I get to take a 3-credit class on interviewing.
Cool.
So it's a lot of fun, and I don't know if you know Frank Sasno. He used to do CNN.
Yes.
Yeah, he's my professor, and he's
okay.
great. And I'm not just saying this because I know he's going to see everything I tape.
Okay.
But so it's a lot of fun. So right now we have like 3 big projects. One is like an excerpted interview, and I'm talking to my friend Kathleen for that. Mm-hmm. One is an oral history, which is what I'm talking to you about today.
Okay.
And then the other one's an expert interview, and I think that one has to be related to sustainability. So
okay.
yeah. So this is our midterm in essence.
I got the pressure.
So how are you doing? How are you?
Good.
Katie's so cute.
Yeah, she's great. She really is. She's not here, so I won't give her a big head. So this morning, Kim has 3 briefs due in like 2 days, so she's basically not been around.
Yeah.
And Katie this morning said, "I have to wear a black dress today." Well, do you have a black dress? Yes, but you have to pick it out for me. Why are you wearing a black dress? I'm having a memorial service for Claire's daddy. Oh, okay. So I thought, wow, that's nice. A friend of hers, her father was killed in Iraq. Before she was born, she was a fetus when her dad was killed. So I thought it was like some school thing because today was the anniversary of his death.
Yeah.
And no, it was Katie and her friend organizing it for her on the playground.
That's so sweet,
isn't it? That's her. That's just the way she is.
Oh my gosh, she's so sweet.
Yeah. So.
Well, like I said, if you ever need a sitter, I don't have much of a social life, and it's very easy to get here.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're really close.
I just took the bus, and it was.
Well, you definitely should come for dinner because we have Patricia lives with us, who's the Spanish teacher at Katie's school. She goes to Washington International.
Oh, cool.
And Katie's grown up speaking Spanish and English.
Oh my gosh.
So she goes to school in Spanish. So Patricia lives here. My mother-in-law lives here. Kim is here. And
so you really are the only guy.
We always have like big dinners almost every night. So
oh gosh.
except tonight we have something because Katie's having her first communion this year.
Oh wow.
Saturday she had her first confession.
Oh.
It went out. It went okay. I was wondering what she confessed.
Didn't it go too long?
No. There was a couple of kids that were in there for a while, but they did a very nicely. The church where we go when we're Catholic, and I went to Catholic school, and they marched us down to our first confession to the gym, and we stood in line, and we got in, and we did it. And if we didn't recite the act of contrition properly, we got yelled at, and then we marched back. They had this little ceremony. The kids did a play of the prodigal son, and they sang songs, and then they went to confession, and they came back and sang some more songs. It was so nice. It was just not what I did.
Oh, before I forget, my father said to say hello.
Okay. Yeah.
And he told me not to ask about a few things. I think one of them was the Nebraska game in '84.
Oh, no. I don't have it anymore, but I used to have a picture. We dressed up in jackets and ties, orange and blue ties.
Oh, God.
And I had a premonition that we were going to win the game. So I was very confident. But we also drank too many dome buckets before the game.
I don't think they have those anymore.
Yes. No, they don't. They don't. Do they sell beer there anymore?
They do.
They do? Okay.
But they're very stringent about it.
Yeah, but it was like these big things that I could hardly hold. And this guy from Nebraska started picking a fight with me. And do you know Matt Picardi?
I know the name, yeah.
Yeah, so he was in law school with us. And Matt, in an effort to save the guy from Nebraska from me, ended up punching me. So it was all very funny.
Oh, God.
But we won the game.
Well, that's the important thing.
Yes, I think on Sports Illustrated cover the week before the game, the question was, "Is this the best Nebraska, the best team ever?" And the next week we beat them. So
Nice.
it was a great game.
It's funny. No one at GW knows anything about sports, so.
Yeah, well, they have a basketball team that sometimes is good, but
We have
they're
a
having
basketball team.
rough year this year.
We've almost won a couple of good games, but it's like when you're from Syracuse, it's hard to compare.
Yeah, I know. And how about the panic over this snowstorm thing? Is it crazy?
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
And my roommates, one's from Colorado and the other one's from Chicago, and one from Chicago doesn't really get snow. So she's like, I don't know what to do. Do I need like snow pants or something? Like, you realize it's gonna be half an inch, the entire city will close down, and we're not gonna have class.
I'm supposed to fly to Boston in the morning, and my flight got canceled already.
Already? It's really warm out too.
Yeah, and I bet it's just gonna rain.
Mm-hmm.
And someone who works for me is up in Boston, and she's checked because I've been on calls for all afternoon.
Yeah.
I came here knowing that I'd be stuck on calls, so I didn't miss our meeting. And she said all the flights show from DC to Boston. There's a shuttle, that goes every hour. Sold out, which means they've canceled them all.
Oh god. That'll be awful with spring break this week. Like, I don't know how people. I'm going to Paris, so I'm hoping that doesn't really affect it.
When are you going?
I'm leaving Friday.
Cool. Have you been there before?
I went there with my dad about 10 years ago now, so...
Because, I work for a French company. I go there once a month.
Really?
Yeah, all the time.
I'm so excited to... I'm going with, 3 of my best friends. It's for a class we're taking. Again, with me not taking real classes, I take a class that meets once every other week and goes to Paris for spring break, and I get 3 credits.
What do you do in Paris? What do you have to do for...
We listen to a few speakers. We were listening to a food writer from the New York Times on Monday when we get there. And, of course, I'm all for that because it's journalism and food, my 2 favorite things. So I'm really excited, though.
If you need restaurant recommendations, let me know.
Ooh, I definitely do. We had a meeting last week, and everyone was saying, I'm so excited for the program, I'm excited for the speakers. I'm like, I'm excited for that, but I really want to eat.
Yeah, it's a good place to go eat. I can't complain about that. So, you want to talk about...
I'm looking to talk kind of about this arc from the 92 election to your time in Russia.
Okay.
And then kind of circling back, if that's...
Sounds good.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So, to dive right in, with the 92 election, that was a tough election. Mm-hmm. Was there a moment you kind of felt this wasn't going to work well?
Yes. So, February of 1991, I am in 1992, excuse me, not 1991, 1992, I'm in New Hampshire, and all of the people that normally would be involved in organizing, like the ground troops, were sitting out the election. They weren't working. And most of them were not working because of Bush going back on his no new taxes pledge. And if that was happening everywhere across the U.S., we were dog doo-doo. So, and that's how it played out. So that was pretty much 3 months into the election cycle, and I knew it was most likely not going to work out.
So why'd you end up working on the campaign if you kind of knew it was a lost cause?
Well, I started in December, and I signed up for the duration and went through the duration, and I'm a start and finish kind of guy.
And you're close friends with the Bushes, correct?
Yeah, I met President Bush when I was in college. I was 19, and he was coming to speak when he was running against Ronald Reagan for president, and he was Ambassador Bush. And I worked at the gymnasium, and I got a call from a professor, a political science professor, who said, "There's this guy coming to speak, and he wants to go for a run in the morning. Can you let him into the gym so he can go out running on the track?" And I said, "Sure." And then he told me it was at 5 a.m. So I went and I opened the door for this guy who was very nice, you know, and I said, "You want company?" He said, "Sure." So I went for a run with President Bush, and that was the best 3 miles I've ever run. So that led to a lot of different things.
Very cool. And kind of going back to the election, you kind of mentioned that your coworkers might not have been as enthusiastic about the election as.
Well, it wasn't so much the coworkers. It was the people. When you have campaigns in New Hampshire, they're Republican operatives. You know, like the grandma in this little town that got everybody organized, got the yard signs, and those are the people that just were sitting out. The people who were the paid staff and the volunteers working on the campaign, they were all engaged and gung ho. And a lot of them, that was their first real campaign experience, which isn't unusual. It's typical.
So you worked Northeast Regional Communications, correct?
Correct.
Were you proud of the job you did?
Yeah. I think I did the best job I could. And for me, I was working in press, and I'm a lawyer. And that was a little stretch, something new for me. So I actually learned a lot. It didn't turn out the way I had hoped, but it was still a good experience.
What would you say you learned?
How to communicate, how to write in a different way, as opposed to a legal brief. Most people don't want to read a legal brief in the Washington Post or the New York Times or in the Lancaster Intelligencer Journal. So that was a learning experience. It was a different way to communicate, and I still use that today. I review press releases and press activity by my current company almost on a daily basis. So it's followed me.
And when was the last time you talked to someone in the Bush family?
Ooh, last year, about the library at a cocktail party. And I think it was in New York.
Okay. So going back to the election, November 4th was day after Election Day, 92. What did you... I know most campaign workers, November 4th, I worked on a campaign, my boss said November 7th this year, I'm on unemployment. What was your next step?
Well, if I remember that day, I had a real bad hangover, to be honest, so I don't think I did much at all. And then I started, looking for something to do because, I was out of a job. And I ended up doing some temporary work for the International Republican Institute, and that took me to the former Soviet Union a couple of times, and then that turned into a job where I went to Moscow for almost 2 years.
And before that whole experience, had you been to what is now Russia before?
No. The closest I ever got was when I was in college, was Poland and the border with, I guess what was Lithuania. But at that time it was the Soviet Union.
And what surprised you the most about going there right after the fall of the Berlin Wall?
How poor the place was. How technologically backward the place was. I grew up in the era of the Soviet Union being the enemy and the primary threat to the security of everybody and potential nuclear war. And when I actually was there and saw the place, I thought, we were afraid of these people? So, outside of the major cities, you go to villages and they didn't have, indoor plumbing, very much, if any, electricity. It was pretty shocking.
No plumbing or electricity.
Yeah. I don't think it was all that different from when Catherine the Great was, running then Russia. It was very surprising. Some things were great technology-wise. I think Moscow still probably has the best metro that I've ever been on in the world. Their underground system was fantastic, but it wasn't something that was pervasive across the country. There was huge differences in how people lived from location to location.
And so what were you really what was your goal when you going into Russia at that point?
Well, the overarching goal of the U.S. government at the time was to create a democratic Russia. How do we do? So there were a lot of different aspects to that. At the International Republican Institute and the Democratic National Institute, the two political parties in the U.S. had international assistance wings. They weren't actually part of the party, but somewhat connected to it. We're working on political party development and campaigning in democracies and that type of activity.
So what did you do specifically with that?
We did a lot of training. Because I was a lawyer, I worked on the election law, the election laws with Russian lawyers, because Soviet elections aren't necessarily the type of elections that we would expect. So training, drafting, a lot of educating. And I got to be a election observer in the first democratic election in Russia as a result of it. So it was a very interesting time. Maybe we could have done things a little differently.
What do you think you could have done differently?
Well, at the very beginning, the Russians really wanted us, and us being Americans, to tell them exactly what to do. And the decision was made at the policy level that they really need to make their own decisions. We didn't want to tell them what to do. In hindsight, we probably should have told them what to do. Now, whether it would have turned out differently than it has today, because my view, Russia is a soft dictatorship, really. Maybe it would have ended up the same way, because the society is the society, and changing a society is very difficult. You can't just change the laws. Our laws, if you placed them in Russia, would probably look a lot different than they do here because of the way we enforce them and live them. So the society has a lot of impact on how things work.
And with that society, one article you wrote for the Fordham International Law Review, if I'm correct.
Oh, yeah.
About
wow, we're going way back, Julie.
I did my research. Called Organized Crime and Corruption in Russia, Implications for the U.S. and International Law.
Yes.
And you refer to them as the Wild East in that article. What was so wild?
Well, a lot of people that were in Soviet positions of power used those positions to enrich themselves. Two, there was a pervasive mafia in the Soviet Union before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Chechnya, which we've all heard of, was an issue for Stalin. And so what Stalin did was, to deal with the Chechen problem, he took most of the population of Chechnya and exiled them to different parts of the Soviet Union. The Chechen language is not related to anything else. So he created a whole group of people that could speak in secret code even when you were listening on their telephones and you don't understand what they're saying. So that was the first really effective mafia organization, so it existed there. Corruption was pervasive in the Soviet Union, and without the military and the secret police on top of it, it was like a pressure cooker of rice that just popped out and was all over the place. I think the killings, the assassinations, the protection rackets, all those things are pretty well documented now because that's history, right?
Yeah. So, when you were writing a lot, I mean, you wrote a lot about the mafia in Russia. Were you ever scared?
Yes, often. I was always very aware of my surroundings. I had a few instances where people tried to break into my apartment, and I was followed on multiple occasions by I'm not sure who. So, yes, it was sometimes a very stressful place to live.
But you were there for how many years?
2 years, and then I came back in 1995, and then I worked at the American Bar Association, which was a program primarily with the Department of Justice, and then I went to the Department of Justice, and all that time I was dealing with Russia and going back and forth from Washington to Moscow and other parts of the former Soviet Union, right up until 9/11.
So you never really, I mean, you did leave Russia, obviously, but I mean, your daughter's named after Catherine the Great.
Yeah, and her middle name's Anastasia, but my wife is half Russian. My mother-in-law is Russian, so there is a Russian connection.
And you're fluent in Russian, right?
Well, I'd say I used to be, but I haven't been there for 10 years. And I haven't used Russian all that much. So my Spanish may be better now than my Russian.
Okay. Fair enough.
Unfortunately, my French isn't so good, which working for a French company is kind of sad.
So kind of jumping back to this whole sort of, teaching democracy, how do you take a topic as complex as democracy and operationalize it and make it something teachable?
It's difficult to do because the mechanics are there, but it's like the mechanics of how things are done in different democracies, and there's basically the established democracies do a lot of things in similar ways, but not exactly the same. There are certain fundamental principles, but the real key for developing a democracy is having a fertile field for those seeds to grow. And in order to have a real democracy work, you have to have a civil society. And the Soviet Union didn't have a civil society, and Russia doesn't have a civil society. And so for that reason, it's been very difficult for it to take hold there. And what that means is how people interact. There's a book, and the author is escaping me, who I've met several times, and I know he's on my bookshelf here somewhere. So Robert Putnam, thank you. I did remember. And he studied democracy. That's what he does. He's a political science professor, and he wrote a book, Making Democracy Work, right around this time when I was in Russia. And he actually came over and did a program with me in Russia. And what he found studying Italy, okay, so Italy, the south of Italy is a feudal society, whereas the north of Italy is completely different, had a history of democracy. He found that he could tell you how quickly, to the second almost, how long it would take you to get a driver's license based on the number of choral groups in that small political jurisdiction. So if we have an ANC, the small political unit here in the District of Columbia, his formula would add up all the different choral groups, plug that in, and tell you how quickly you could get your driver's license. And what that really says is that
when people interact and they share outside of the family or a close-knit group, government actually works better.
Yeah.
But when you look at that in the context of Russia and the former Soviet Union, it kind of dooms them to failure because there isn't any of that. Everyone interacts within their family or a closed group because in the Soviet Union that was dangerous. So that doesn't really give you a lot of warm and fuzzy feelings about future development, and it's probably generational for Russia.
Kind of going back to this sort of not so warm and fuzzy topic.
Yeah.
Were you ever scared for your life when you were followed?
A few times. I was in Belarus and I was there by myself, and I was meeting with some government types, and Belarus has been labeled the only remaining dictatorship in Europe, I think, even to this day, okay? And they weren't so warm and welcoming to me, and I was being driven out to the airport, and we went down this back road, which wasn't the way I came in, and I really truly thought, oh, these guys are just going to shoot me out in the field somewhere. Well, they were just taking a shortcut. Yeah, I can't say I've had any close calls. I saw a number of firefights between armed groups that I couldn't figure out who they were in the streets in various locales, and I was there when they had the tanks in the street and the fighting in Moscow in the early Yeltsin years. So there were some moments.
Was there sort of this overarching fear, or this overarching sense of paranoia?
Russians were very, very careful and very wary of their surroundings because the police were more feared of being someone who's going to shake you down and steal your money as to someone who would actually protect you from crime. So there was this whole aura of concern for your safety. And it wasn't just me, and it wasn't just foreigners, it was Russians as well.
And kind of bringing it back to today, do you think, you kind of mentioned it's a loose dictatorship, so do you think things are looking up?
No, I don't. I think it's probably, like I said earlier, generational for Russia to come out of what it is now, which is really a soft dictatorship. And where they're headed in the next 20 years, I really can't predict. And the other thing is, I've really gotten away from Russia and things Russian. I don't deal with it anymore. I have a completely different area of focus.
Why such a drastic change? I mean, since you've spent time in Russia, you've worked for Treasury, Homeland Security, and now you're out in the private sector.
Well, when 9/11 occurred, I was supposed to go the next day on the 12th of September with the Deputy Attorney General to Budapest to see if we could convince the Hungarians to stop letting Russians travel there visa-free, because the Russians were using Hungary as a base of operations for European criminal activities. But that never happened, and I ended up going to Azerbaijan, Baku, because I had done a lot of work there, and we were asking the government to use their air bases for an attack on Afghanistan. So I was there for a little bit. When I came back, I went to Treasury, and Treasury was all about terrorist financing. And so instead of going to Moscow on business trips, I was going to Dubai and Riyadh and all these different places that I hadn't really done before. And so everything changed. But what didn't change with that was terrorist financing is like money laundering. And I did a lot of organized crime cases, and organized crime is all about the money, which is basically money laundering cases. So instead of trying to prevent the organized criminals from benefiting from their enterprise, whatever it might be, just doing the same thing with terrorists and trying to cramp down the finance system to bleed off what resources they might have. That was actually a lot of fun.
Dealing with terrorists is fun?
Cutting off their money is fun. Especially after 9/11, I think everybody just wanted to go over somewhere and beat somebody with a stick. But so it was a very rewarding job because you saw results, and that took me away from Russia. So I've done a little bit with Russia since. My company's an aviation company, and we do work in Russia, but most of my focus is elsewhere.
Do you think you'll ever go back?
I've promised my daughter I'll take her there, so yes. If they let me in. I'm not quite sure if they will. I have to get a visa to go there. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh. Okay, so those are all the questions I planned on asking. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have asked about?
You didn't ask me if I liked the food.
Did you like the food?
No, I didn't like the food.
How were you in a country for 2 years without liking the food?
Well, I lost a lot of weight there. I did. And I used to do trips to Western Europe just to eat. Yeah. And the weather was, we've both lived in Syracuse, right? So we know winter.
Yeah.
We think, no. I never had the tears in my eyes freeze in Syracuse, and I used to have that happen fairly often in Moscow.
Gosh.
It was just a special kind of cold, and there were a lot of interesting things about being there. But what I didn't like was just the dictatorial pull of the whole society, because they never had a democracy there, which is kind of sad.
So, what do you miss the most?
From Russia? What do I miss? The Tchaikovsky Music Hall. It's a world-class symphony hall, and it was between my apartment and my office, and I'd often walk home, and I'd look and see who was there, and frequently it would be world-renowned stars, and since I had a residency permit for Moscow, I could buy a ticket for $2 and walk in and listen. It was fantastic. That was one of my favorite things. I love the museums. There's the Pushkin Museum, but there's the Tretyakov Museum, which is like the Russian Louvre. It's all Russian, and there's these Russian impressionists you've never heard of who are great. I like that. So there were good things, and I made good friends over there. I have a Russian woman who worked for me in Russia with the American Bar Association when I was working at the American Bar Association, and then she worked at the U.S. Embassy for the Department of Justice for me for a number of years, and she's now married to a friend of mine, and she lives like 6 blocks that way, and she works at the Treasury Department, and she's now a U.S. citizen. So, and so there were good things, and I learned so much over there, so much. It was a learning experience. Life is always a learning experience. I like learning things.
What was the most important thing you learned?
The most important thing I learned from Russia was you need to look behind the words that people are saying. Because in Russia, no one ever said what they meant. And the other thing is that in Russia, Russians look like we do. And at least like I do, right? And tend to think that they're like we are, but they've grown up in a totally different environment, and they don't think like we do, and they don't act like we do, and making those assumptions can cause some problems.
Were there any problems?
Yes, there were misunderstandings. Absolutely.
Like what?
Absolutely. Just general how things go. The assumptions that, one, as an American, that we all follow the rules. Right? We don't really think about that. But for the most part, we all follow the rules. The people that don't, they get punished for it. Russians, at least when I lived there, almost never followed the rules. The rules were there to be avoided, ignored, or abused. And so when you're coming from those two different contexts, when you're talking and you have an agreement with someone, they may not be thinking the same way that you are. Oh, we have an agreement. Okay. Well, actually, we don't have an agreement. We'll talk about it later. There's a saying in the business world that once you sign a contract in Russia, then the negotiation begins. So.
Very cool. Again, anything I didn't touch on that I should have?
No, not that I can think of. Did I do okay?
You did very well. Okay. Thank you. Here, let me get the recording off. Also, you got my SD card. There we go.